Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of DevOps Cafe. Coming to you today from San Francisco, I'm Damon Edwards.
Hey, this is John Willis. I'm actually in Berlin at DevOps Days Berlin.
Ich bin ein DevOpser.
Yes, sir.
That's awesome. And John, I saw you in San Francisco at the DevOps Enterprise Summit last week. That was pretty outstanding.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was second year. I think the videos will blow people away. Actually, me, you, and our guest all will have videos within the next couple of weeks up.
Yeah, pretty excited about that. So
Yeah.
let's get right to our guest. Nobody wants to hear us talk, anyways. Somebody who you might have seen, I guess a very interesting addition to the DevOps community. She's a professor, a statistician, business expert. Is now kind of lending her expertise to us folks in the IT operations space. Professor Nicole Forsgren, how you doing?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on. Good to
No,
join.
thanks for joining us. So, all right, we're going to do our first traditional question because I really was kind of drawing a blank in how to properly introduce you and represent your your background, right? It's not the usual one we talk to on the show. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you became Dr. Nicole Forsgren and a little about your history.
The road is long and winding,
Yeah.
right? It's got to be some of that for everyone.
Well, that's why we ask it, everybody. And people say they love to hear people's personal history, but it's always never expected. So that's why it's fun.
Okay, so I started out, get this, as an AS400 programmer.
Oh, wow.
Word. Yeah,
Wow.
green screen for the win.
That's hilarious.
Um,
Wow.
Yeah, it's great. So, like, the super fun thing is that I landed my first job before I had my first class. It was great, and so the joke is that they threw me a manual, and I think the best part is that no one told me it was going to be hard, so I just figured it out. It was great, and so I did that, and sort of I think is how so many of us fall into ops is that we ended up supporting the systems that we worked on, right? So I did that for a few years, and then ended up so I did that through college. And then ended up getting an internship at IBM as a software engineer and did that for a couple years. And then did consulting for a little bit and then ended up also getting a job as a hardware engineer. And at some point decided that some of my consulting felt like everything felt like a hammer and everything looked like a nail. And so I decided that I wanted to go get a PhD because I wanted to see if I could solve problems in really, really different ways. And I really thought I was going to do database research because I love databases. I had stumbled into doing a lot of database work. And at some point I was working at IBM, so I actually worked at IBM full-time through my PhD. Pro tip, don't do that. Bad idea. Don't work full-time through your PhD program. They don't like that. They tend to try to kick you out. But I did like this usability study at one point, and it was on backup and replication processes because I was in hardware, and I was actually in hardware enterprise disk performance. I specialized at the time in RAID rebuild. And so we wrote up this report. I worked with Todd Ishid, and we submitted it to IBM, and they were like, well, what are you talking about? We followed UCD guidelines, user-centered design guidelines. And all of a sudden, this light bulb went off, and I was like, wait, IBM, this company that specializes in enterprise disk storage for specialized advanced users, doesn't realize that sysadmins are a thing? Like, they don't know that this user group behaves differently than everyone else in the world? Changing my dissertation. Everything's different. So I completely changed everything from that point forward. So I had to convince my committee that sysadmins and advanced computer users were worth studying. They didn't like it. Like, it was a fight. It was a massive, massive fight. And the title of my dissertation, I couldn't even include that. So I think the title of my dissertation, if I can remember off the top of my head, was it was something like an investigation of tool use in high-risk and complex work environments, something like that. Like, I couldn't even say IT operations or sysadmins because, that was just the context. That wasn't what I was studying. They just happened to be the users. It was a fight. And so, but that was I was like, I was convinced this was a thing and it was super important. But everyone else is like, nope, they're just users, just like anyone else. So, like, fast forward all these years, so I started studying how, so like, it's funny, so if I say this in academic language, that'll, like, if we parse it, if we pick it apart, it's basically DevOps, but I started in probably 06 or 07, and it's the organizational and cultural factors and implications that influence and contribute to tool use and choice, in, like automation and tool use in high-risk and complex environments, and how that tool use and choice influences individual, team, and organizational impacts and outputs and factors. And I also look at knowledge use and knowledge sharing in those environments, which, like, as we think about that and pick that apart, that's basically DevOps, right? So we look at organizational and cultural impacts and the automation, the tool use, and then knowledge sharing and all of that in there. So DevOps is just like the much easier way to say that.
Right. So where did the statistics and teaching position and all that come from? Where did that come into the tale?
So when you get a PhD is basically a research degree. And when you do all of that, you have to be able to, so part of it's research design. You have to find really good ways to ask the questions and measure those things. So some of the analytics came from all of my hardware enterprise disk. You have to be able to do log analysis. So all of my log analysis was analytics. So like classical log analysis. My first year or two in grad school was deception detection, and we did like traditional text analysis, and so that was pretty strong analytics work, and then just traditional stats methods from there. And then once I started doing perceived effects as well, once I started tying in organizational and cultural effects, then I really, really needed to be able to pick up, mixed methods approaches. So I can do traditional log analysis and I can do traditional analytics, but once I needed to pick up perceived effects, then I really needed to learn how to also do things like survey methods and psychometrics. And so I've picked that up as well, so I can do mixed effects, and I know how to do write really, really good survey questions and do survey methods as well. Which is what got me into other survey methods.
So Nicole, you know I'm a big fan of yours, and so I'm going to sound a little brutal at first on the survey.
Do it.
The fact that you're a data scientist, in fact, this is going to educate me. And so a little history here, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get my numbers right, but in 2013, I think it was like 1,000 respondents. So I have two things I want you to break down for me.
Yeah.
As a data scientist, but don't go too crazy because I might not understand what you're talking about. Neither might half of our people. But I want you to be able to break down two things. I love the survey. I think it's great.
Well, John, why don't you introduce the survey as to people who don't know about it?
Well, I was going to. Anyway, yeah,
okay,
the Puppet Lab survey.
So we're talking about the Puppet Lab State of DevOps survey, right?
Okay, good. Okay. All right, perfect.
Awesome.
So two things. Survey. It's been the fourth year in 2015, and so I originally I loved the survey because it's the way I love Gartner, right? Like I think Gartner originally. Now my mind has changed on this, but originally I would use Gartner to prove a point. But in general, when Gartner would say things, I didn't generally like live by what they told. What I did is I used a point. So early on in the survey, it was easy for us to use some of the data to move a point, but I thought there was two issues with the survey. The first one, I thought maybe the numbers were too low to really get an accurate sense of really is this giving me value, and then there's this forced echo chamber of how people go into the survey. Then in 2014, we went from whatever that number, whether it was 1,000 or whatever, we went up to like 10,000, which I said, okay, things are getting real now. The numbers seem to get better. It's still echo chamber-ish. Now we're at 20,000 in 2015. I think we're really breaking ice here, Tell me from a statistician, at what point of my two problems I've always had, one is I think our numbers, I'd like to know, did the numbers always matter, or are they starting to matter now that they're 20,000? And what is is there an issue with an echo chamber, and how does a data scientist explain the value of the data? Did I make sense there on my question?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Totally
good.
makes sense. Now, so there are a few competing issues here. So one is like the size of the sample, right? So I will say like the very first year I wasn't involved at all. The second year I was involved, but only at the very, very end. And it was interesting. I actually bumped into a couple people from Puppet Labs at Cascadia IT conference here in Seattle, and said, let me know if you want me to do any analysis. I'd be happy to step in, right? This is one of those things where it's like, I did not plan this. And I took a look at the data, and I realized there wasn't much analysis opportunities available, right? They had asked a bunch of yes/no questions. And so from a psychometric design perspective, there wasn't much analysis you could do. There were no shades of gray. There was yes, there was no. There were census-based only questions.
And this
right?
was 2012, right?
This was, 2000.
Okay.
This was the second year.
The second one, which was 13.
The second year, yeah.
All
And so I was like, there are a couple things I can do. You should totally give me a call next year, and I will help you design your study. I can help you design a few questions. We can take a look. And so they had a high enough N there. N is like number of respondents. Depending on the analysis that you do, you don't necessarily need a giant number. Again, depending on the analysis that you do. So it is going to be a little bit of echo chambery. So to address that, I'll talk about, data collection. Some people say that the methods that we're using aren't great. To a certain extent, that's what we have, though. We use what's called a snowball sampling method, which is we blast for responses through like social media, mailing lists where we know we can collect people. We say, if you take the survey, feel free to send it on to other people that you know. This is actually a relatively acceptable method for certain populations of people that we know that have certain characteristics. One of those characteristics is that they're difficult to find. So like you and I and Damon were like, but we know how to find these people, right? We know how to find them because we go to certain conferences where DevOps is a thing. But in general, people who work in DevOps are difficult to find because job titles don't necessarily say DevOps. There isn't necessarily one master mailing list that says, these are the DevOps people, right? Another characteristic is they don't necessarily like being studied. This is starting to go away, but when I started doing this work formally in 2007 for my dissertation, it was really, really telling because IBM came to me and they said, come out to Watson, come out to our research lab, we will let you collect any data you want, and you can use all of it for your dissertation. I showed up to do this data collection, and so this is an example, an anecdote, and 1 month prior, someone started studying these people, and they were going to be subject to a study, and they're like, yay, we're going to study these people. And when they studied them, it was for lean, and they were leaned them out, and 60% of the workforce was cut. So historically, anytime anyone in these positions have been studied, it's been for the purpose of leaning them out, or cutting them in half, or decimating the workforce. And so a lot of this population is difficult to find. They don't like to be studied. It's tricky to find them. So the joke is that other populations like this that don't like to be studied are those in at-risk health populations, or those like in prostitution who, they're difficult to find. They don't like to be studied because there's some kind of risk for them to self-identify.
Hold on, that's tweet-worthy.
Three
Types of people
right?
who don't want to be studied: people with the communicable diseases, prostitutes, and DevOps.
and the DevOps.
That's right. The DevOps, right?
The DevOps. Yeah, I know. So
that's interesting.
And so, well, but when you think about it, right, there's no master mailing list. We can't necessarily search for job titles. And for years, there has been real risk at self-identifying and being studied, because most of the time when your organization asks for you to be studied, it's because your job's about to get cut, or because they're drastically trying to reorganize and cut your workforce. And so that's why this type of a study, this type of data collection is legit.
So here's a question I'd have. So I mean, I think that the fact that this is a rigorous sort of academic focused rigorous background to it, I think is unique, right? A lot of times in the technology industry, we see studies, and it's basically someone sent out a Survey Monkey, and you get a bunch of pie charts that say everything's amazing and great, right? And I think this is kind of interesting in the rigor behind it. And you dig into it, it's like, wow, this is a lot of interesting information. What are the key takeaways? Like, what are the key things? If someone's going to put this, usually how I've seen people be excited to see this, or I send someone a link to this, is when they're like, I need to prove it to my boss, or I need to soften this conversation, or I need to, I've got the common sense and I've got my internal data, but they want to get a better sense of what the rest of the world is doing, right? It's that kind of safety blanket before they make any kind of a decision or commitment. As an organization, right? Usually budgetary or whatever it is. So like, oh, this is great. But I kind of get a sense that at that point they're just sort of kind of winging it themselves to figure out how to use this to their advantage. How would you recommend people? I guess two-part question. How would you recommend they use this, and to put it in front of their bosses? And what are kind of the key takeaways? What are the big aha things either you've seen or you've seen people react to that you suggest that they can point to, or they say this is something you should really take a look at?
Well, luckily, I mean, the greatest thing we've seen in the last couple of years is really, really solid feedback saying, we've finally been able to get buy-in, because this study has really, really shown in a real way that this has good impacts for business. And it's like you mentioned, I mean, this is a good study. This is a rigorous study right now. We've got 3 papers under peer review. And it was designed, so I just left academia this year, but I was a professor before that. My entire goal was to get tenure and to have papers under peer review. And so this was designed for the purpose of generating data and generating research that I could get under peer review. So there are a few things that I would suggest people going through the study do when they're trying to communicate something to the business. The first thing I would do is think about what is important to your business. What is important to your management chain? What is important to your business? And start there and then work backwards. So is the thing that's important to your business revenue generation? Is, who is your customer? And then work backward from there. And, especially in the 2015 report, we included some pretty solid numbers. I'm actually pulling up the report right now so I can look really, really quickly at the page number. But we included some, so on the comparison of IT performance on page 10. So we look at, the high performers versus the low performers. And the key takeaways for IT performance, we look at deployment frequency, deployment lead time, mean time to recover, and change success rate. And if you just want to go there, because then we have numbers comparing the highest performers and the lowest performers. You can say, if we can implement DevOps, we can get these types of numbers. And then think about what it means to you in your industry. Is high performance versus low performance in terms of throughput and stability? Does that mean value delivery for your business? Does this mean, is the most important message to take to your boss speed to market? Does this mean value in terms of A/B testing? Does this mean value in terms of, maybe you find yourself in a situation where you actually have no competitors, but compliance and regulatory changes might be a significant impact to you. And in that case, speed of getting code to market in compliance and regulatory changes is significant. We all find ourselves in some kind of situation where moving at velocity is important. We somehow might find ourselves in a situation, like I said, where we don't need to get speed to market. We might not need to get speed of code out because our customers just don't care. But at minimum, we have to get compliance and regulatory changes out. There might be a security bug that comes out, and we want to be able to address that quickly. And then look at stability. We at least need to be able to deal with, mean time to restore. If our code goes down, being able to get a new code release pushed out quickly, either a rollback code release pushed out quickly or a new code stability release pushed out quickly. And we can think about those things and catering that message to the business in those types of terms. And then, I was really, really excited about, a few other things that we presented in the 2015 report as well, because we looked at, we took it one more step. What types of things lead to IT performance? If you're another step along the way and you want to start building in continuous delivery, page 14 looks at, we know, or, we've assumed that continuous delivery is important in IT performance.
Right.
And it is. What are the three most important aspects? If we know we want to be doing continuous delivery, what are the key aspects of that? What makes up continuous delivery in an important, impactful way? And by the way, when you read that chart, so it has these little boxes and arrows are predictive. This is a fully predictive model, and it was tested in partial least squares.
Right. So that's actually that's the next thing I was going to ask you about. So looking, there's kind of a couple of these sort of fishbone diagrams, right? And one's page 14. It's about the continuous delivery packages. We'll talk about that one, right? So it's got like comprehensive, fast, and reliable test and deployment automation. Next box underneath that, trunk-based deployment and continuous integration. Underneath that, application code and app and system configuration and all in version code. All three of those boxes feeds into together the factors on the left, model continuous delivery, right? Which that feeds into lower levels of deployment pain, higher levels of IT performance, lower change fail rates, and that all feeds into higher levels of org performance. So I guess the question is that like your hypothesis, or is that actually something that was proven out via the data so by looking at the data in this survey, you were able to make all those links and say this has been validated by, that's the point, right? You're saying that this is actually not just guessing, this is actually validated by the breadth of the data from across the industry.
It was proven out in the data, and right now that particular model happens to be under peer review.
Very cool.
So it was hypothesized, but it also is currently under peer review. So like with R-squares, with beta coefficients, with all the things. The thing that I particularly like, and this was part of my talk at DevOps Enterprise Summit, you can think about this another way, right? So you mentioned, as you read through this diagram, comprehensive, fast, reliable deployment automation, trunk-based deployment, continuous integration, application code. Together, these things model continuous delivery. Continuous delivery leads to doing the work better. It leads to higher IT performance and lower change fail rates. This makes us do our work better. Do what else it leads to? It leads to the work feeling better. It leads to lower levels of perceived deployment pain. Not only do we do the work better, the work feels better. And that's a big deal, because as we were going through and as we were creating the survey last year, it was when so many things were hitting the news and so many things were going through, and we realized that we do DevOps because we want the work to be better, but we also want to make our lives better, right? We want the work to be better, but we also want it to feel better. We don't want to kill ourselves all the time. So CD not only actually makes the work better, and by the way, IT performance does carry all the way through to increase org performance, but it also does decrease levels of deployment pain. And so, by the way, this did confirm the hypotheses that we had. But yeah, this is fully tested. This is backed up by the data.
So Nicole, one of the things, I'm a meat and potatoes guy, right? So, my kind of the thing that, like, last year to me was, again, going back to I'm going to kind of re-ask that echo chamber question here. But one of the things last year, I thought, again, if I wanted to use the numbers to prove things, so I wanted, the thing is, Damon, myself, you, there's a bunch of us have been talking about this for years. And now we've got some data. Last year we had more data, this year a bit more data. I think it's tremendous that you're involved in this and you can prove out things. So I feel confident that the data means something. But last year, one of the things, a watershed to me was the MTTR, right? Like this idea that we always say DevOps has these counterintuitive things where people say, oh, I can never deploy faster because in our environment. And we found through the survey that it was 46x likely to have a better MTTR. And then this year, like, it's a glaring 168x according to, like, oh my God, like, why? I have one slide in my DevOps State of Union which shows the MTTR at 46x and 168x and success change rate from 3x to 60x. So the numbers are off the chart, basically saying that this model that we've been talking about for 5 or 6 years, some people 8 or 10 years, is working. But how do we convince people that, because most of the way that people get into the survey, we're asking people who kind of are already like in this game these questions, and how do we how do you kind of explain out that the difference between the echo, like if I'm going to blast 168x, right, and with complete confidence, how do I explain that to somebody from a data scientist perspective that can be turned into something that I can say, yes, this isn't just an echo chamber number.
So with any research, there are always going to be limitations, right? And we own this, right? So in this year's report, we state all of the limitations. So the limitations with this report is that the only people who took this report are the people who have heard of DevOps. So there are going to be people who didn't participate in this survey this year who have never, ever heard of DevOps. And so the people who are way, way behind the curve, who've never heard of DevOps, their responses are not listed, or not captured. Their data is not in here. So the data is going to be skewed a bit because that's what happens. Although we think we account for that. We think we deal with some of those limitations by, in part, we were specifically looking for people who at least were familiar with DevOps. We are comparing high versus low performers. And so for the people who are at least aware of DevOps but not doing it particularly well, we were very transparent with that data. And so, we capture that and we model it and we communicate, what the median performance level is of all of that data in the report this year. So you're right. I mean, there is going to be some bias in the data because we don't capture people who are doing absolutely none of this at all. Because, we come across these people, right? We come across teams and organizations who have never heard of DevOps and who aren't doing any of this at all. And they obviously aren't going to be captured in this data because they never got the survey.
Well, so I don't understand. I mean, this is just the way I saw it. Is I saw that big jump, that big jump John's talking about, and the difference in the high performers and low performers. In my mind, I read that as, well, that's because so many large enterprises have now heard the concept DevOps or are putting their toe in the water, and so the pool has gotten bigger, which is why you've seen the big gap versus, in years past, of course, this is my hypothesis, it means nothing, right? But in years past, it was a smaller kind of self-selecting community, so they tend to be more in the bleeding edge. They tend to adopt a lot of these techniques already. The gap between the high performers and low performers is going to be smaller. Does that make sense, or am I kind of off base there?
Well, so we thought that might be one case. And see, this is the fun part of research is that here are the results that we find. What could possibly be the case? So, right. So by the way, this research was also done with Gene Kim and Jez Humble. So we sit down and we see this. We see these results. Here's the other really, really interesting thing. So, well, first of all, I'll guess about why we see this gap increasing. I'll note that we see this gap increasing only in stability. We aren't necessarily seeing it in throughput. And here are the guesses that we have. First of all, we're seeing this increase in stability, and we're seeing it increase, and this could be for a few reasons. The first might be that the people who were doing really well are doubling down, right? They're good, they're getting better, they're increasing their investments. And in part, when we think about emergency changes, they could be improving on their emergency change process, right? MTTR, when you're increasing your ability to get your mean time to restore faster, it could be that your emergency change process suddenly just looks a lot like your regular change process, right? It's no longer scrambling. You're just getting much, much better at that. Your change fail rate is going down because your integrated test environment, your continuous integration, your continuous delivery environment is getting much, much better and much, much cleaner. Okay? Mm-hmm. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about. And the groups that were already good are just getting better because they already had some of that architecture in place. And so any investments that they put into this are that much more impactful. Then we sat down and we said, okay, so we notice that deployment frequency and deployment lead time didn't change. It's still 30x for deployment frequency. It's still 200x for deployment lead time. Why is that?
Yeah, okay.
It
So you're
could
saying
be
that as an industry, the real advancement is coming in stability, or everyone's getting faster. I mean, there has been a lot of focus on deployment, right? So,
well, and it could be that it might not matter, right? If you can deploy every 5 minutes or every 1 minute or whatever that math works out to be, does it really matter if you can deploy every 30 seconds or every 15 seconds?
Right.
Because when we think about it, the ability to push code, so we've always made the big distinction that you can push code whenever you want, but do you push it to your customers? No. You push it to customers when it makes sense for the business. That should be a business decision, right? So the ability to push code even faster and faster and faster and faster doesn't make sense. So what really is the differentiator there, where you really make investments, is probably in something like adding a pre-prod environment so that you can then do A/B testing, right? That's where you're really going to start to see some type of investment, but that's big, right? That's going to be a big architecture change and a big architecture investment. And so some companies might not be prepared to make that. So instead they're doubling down on really upping their stability, really upping their MTTR, their change fail rates, because they have such an efficient throughput pipeline, right? Everything else is fantastic. They don't need anything else because they can already push to customers. They are no longer bottlenecked. They no longer have constraints on pushing code. They're happy. Yeah. They're fine.
No, I think
that's the highest performers.
It's so cool that you brought that up because I forgot about that. It was like weird on the chart, like nothing changed on the 200 and the 30x, right? Like, and I think one of my theories would be that, which is something we say in DevOps all the time, which is don't get caught up on the how many deploys a day, right? It's almost it's a glaring message that didn't increase. That we've seen a variance now with enterprises coming in. And their cadence versus the insane cadence of somebody like Amazon doing 1,000 or whatever the numbers are now, they're off the chart. And then an enterprise that's coming in that's trying to. I think I hadn't really thought about it until you said it. Like I think the killer story here is resiliency.
Well, I mean, don't get caught up on it unless it impedes your ability to deploy whenever you want to in terms of a business decision. Right?
Yeah, no, brilliant.
If you're caught doing it once a year or twice a year, absolutely. Get stuck on that until you can do it whenever you want. Yeah. But once you can do it whenever you want, absolutely.
Yeah, focus on the confidence. So here's another, switching to another page here, page 20. This chart kind of stuck out at me. I was like, whoa, it's deploys per day per dev, right?
And isn't that one fun?
Yeah, and I kind of feel like if it's as impactful as I think, I kind of feel like you guys are bearing the lead here, putting on page 20. But it's essentially, for those who are kind of listening along here, it's a there's three lines. It's kind of the x-axis or the y-axis is kind of the vertical one is deployment frequency, and the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is number of developers. And for the medium performers, it's pretty straight. Like it's pretty flat line that the number of deploys doesn't really increase increases slightly as you add the number of developers going from
but
0
not
to 10
really.
to 100. Yeah, it's just kind of flat.
You really
And then,
have to look for it.
yeah, and then the low performers, something everyone's kind of used to, is the bigger you get, the number of deployed
It
of
tanks.
it
Bad
tanks, right?
news.
It dips down, which is kind of like this idea of everyone knows this. You know, you start, you're small, you're fast, you're nimble. Organizations get bigger in kind of this classic model, and things start to grind to a halt, right? You see this in a lot of big enterprises where it just, the more developers you add, the more the more organizational complexity you have, the slower things get. But the high performers, it's this weird hockey stick curve where the number of developers, the number of deploys kind of scales, I guess, exponentially with the number of developers that you have. It sort of senses this uncoupling where, as they're adding more developers, they're getting more productivity, which is sort of kind of the opposite of all the things we learned from the Mythical Man Month and those kind of things, where where the number of developers you add only makes a project worse, right? It's a very interesting chart, and I just kind of wonder what your thought on that is, and am I reading that correctly? And if so, isn't that a pretty major deal to put on page 20?
You absolutely are reading it correct. So this is actually fascinating. So part of this was prompted by the talk that I gave at DevOps Enterprise last year, 2014. In my DevOps and the Bottom Line talk, I was giving a little bit of the history of where we all came from. And there's a slide on that talk about Etsy and how they got to where they are, and how I think it was Mike Britton gave a talk at QCon in London, and they were doing 30 deploys per day in I think 2013 or 2014. And then April of the next year they were doing I think like 50 deploys per day, and then or March of the next year they were doing 50 deploys per day, and then April of next year they were doing 80 to 90 deploys per day. And Gene Camp talks about sitting in the audience and going, just thinking to himself, that's amazing. And then the light bulb went off in his head thinking, the only thing that could have changed is the number of developers. And so we threw in questions with the State of DevOps survey to capture how many developers that they had. And so we were running some of the numbers, and it just, it wasn't working. But then we realized, of course it's not going to work, because the more people you throw at a problem, the crazier it gets.
Yeah.
Unless, like, you're doing the DevOps, right? If you have, so I'm sorry.
I just laughing to say doing the DevOps
right now. If you have all of your practice and your process and your methodology down, right? Because we're like,
right.
Well, duh, this is Etsy.
Right.
If you're like the epitome of, and not just like the high performers, okay?
Mm-hmm.
If you're Amazon, if you're Etsy, if you have all of your, if you've got it down, if you have this down to a science, right? I'm like hitting my fist here. I'm like,
right.
If I'm saying this. So then we took a look, okay? So we went through the data and we're like, okay, for the companies that have this down and they are able to deploy at least once per day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was how we pulled some of this through. Yeah, okay, so what we did, and luckily we included all of this, and I was so proud. Puppet was wonderful this year. They let us include so much methodology this year. This is such a science report. They were lovely. So what we did is we looked at the high, medium, and the low performers, but we only included the high, medium, and low performers that were deploying at least once per day. And then we graphed those. And so even the low performers, if they're deploying at least once per day, imagine a low performer that's deploying once per day. You're deploying once per day, but you're scrambling like
right.
crazy, right? Your culture's not great. Something's crazy, but you're shoving something out the door once per day.
It's like someone said,
right?
you're driving faster, but you're crashing into everything.
Exactly.
Right.
You're a medium performer. It's kind of okay, but you're shoving something out the door, right?
Mm.
Like you're doing everything possible. everything's going to kind of catch up, but you're trying. Now, a high performer deploying once per day, though, you are a well-oiled machine. We graphed that, and this is the graph that you see.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty striking. I think that's one of those things that's going to make people think. There's a lot more behind this, and I'd be interested to see where it goes.
Mm-hmm. And that's where we realized this is some really, really interesting, maybe not evidence, maybe not proof, but maybe some evidence that these investments are going to be worth it.
Yeah.
Here's some additional evidence that these investments are worth it, because if you really want to break through this mythical man month, if you can get all of your practice, your process, your culture in place, you can really get these deploys down. You can start increasing your manpower, and you can actually get these deploys up in a way that, like you said, we're seeing this hockey stick. And that was really, really exciting.
So I have a couple more things that I definitely want to ask. One, this is an ego thing. So last year when you guys were doing the survey, I was starting my startup with soccer playing, and I was very interested. Not that I'm still not interested in what are the kind of DevOps network questions. So Gene banged me, and I think I submitted a couple of networking questions. And
yes,
I remember seeing
squeeze a few of them in.
Yeah, you guys let me get kind of a little bit play a little bit. Was there any interesting data out of that? I was going back quickly through the report. I didn't notice.
I'm trying to remember now.
I thought I had saw something, but if it's not on the tip of your brain right now.
Off the top of my head.
So then I'll go into the more faceting. So that was more of an ego thing. I wanted people to know that I actually did submit some questions. So.
Yes. We got some of the networking ones in. We did get the burnout ones in.
Well, that was the two that I kind of wanted to go in on is like the diversity. All three of us know the power of diversity in general. So I'd like you to walk through that, and then the burnout as well. And then I'm asking two, and I'm going to have a comment that I do fear a little bit. And I don't think I've ever had a Twitter fight with Gene, but the closest we ever came, which is I think the danger of this report kind of implying that DevOps cures, and I know that's not what you guys said, but I worry a lot about the wrong perception of the data implying that DevOps, and probably DevOps done wrong, could be perceived as an anti-burnout, right? So anyway, so those are my three things. Tell us about the diversity, tell us about the burnout, and if you will, do you have any thoughts on my comment about?
So I'll start with diversity. It was really interesting to me as I was starting to write up some of the peer review on the 2014 data that there had never been questions on diversity before. Like, there's just none of it in there. So we at least threw in some questions on diversity this year. And it actually surprised me at how low our diversity numbers were. So historically in ops data, strictly IT ops, like coming out of the Lisa crowd, we tend to see 8 or 9% ops. At one point we hit about 11%. Awesome, double digits, but we're still back around 8 or 9%. Traditionally in the dev crowd, we tend to be around 20%, although that is halved. We've dropped. We've been cut in half since about the 80s. So seeing that the respondents were only about 5%, the respondents, 5% self-identified as female, that was really, really pretty low. And more than half of the respondents reported working on teams that were less than 10% female. So so I would say that in part it's surprising. It was surprising for me to see that we're so low female. On the other hand,
does a data scientist ever get depressed? Is it just numbers for you, or because I keep saying to myself, depressing, and I wonder, data scientists, you can't go.
we use the word surprising.
Oh, yeah.
Surprising. Although DevOps tends to be a very young culture that tends to be associated with programmer culture, particularly in Silicon Valley. And so So I say that it's surprising because it's so low, but on the other hand, culturally, it's not surprising. Although it does also tend to be a little bit more empathetic, so I hope to see that change a bit, particularly moving forward. But that's really all we have in terms of the demographics. It was something that I hope that we can continue to include moving forward.
And the burnout?
The burnout we included. Now we didn't include the full MBI, so there is a formal. There is a known existing validated instrument called the MBI, the Maslach Burnout Inventory. Although it's quite long, and the survey was already relatively long this year, we heard some feedback about that. Although it's interesting because the survey was no longer this year than it was the previous year, but it was cognitively taxing this year. So we included a shortened measure of it that was only about 6 questions. It was 7 questions, but only 6 of them were reliable and valid when I did all of the statistical tests. But I think the MBI is about 20 questions, so we only had about 6. But they were very, very statistically reliable and valid. They passed all of those tests and measures. And when we included them in some of the models, they were shown both in the lean management one, and then when I went back for peer review on the continuous delivery one, they were both shown. Those practices were shown to decrease perceived feelings of burnout. So this is not a medically sound diagnostic tool. This does not mean it will actually reduce a medical diagnosis of burnout, but it does suggest that it can reduce or decrease feelings of burnout in the workforce if we are doing good things such as good continuous delivery practices and using our good lean management practices.
Well, certainly if we're reducing our MTTR and increasing our change success rate, that has something to say with the hours of sleep that I guess professionals get, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and especially, if you take a look at the lean management practices, and it's funny because some people say, well, of course it makes sense, but this is actually based on, anytime we do some of these things, it has to be based on prior literature and prior theory. So I can't just throw things in because it makes sense, although sometimes I'm sure Gene wants to strangle me, but he's learned to have some discussions with me, and it has to be based on prior theory. There have to be some pre-existing reasons why, and some pre-existing theory for why I believe this relationship should exist, particularly because we don't have. So by the way, can I give like a super quick research 101? For there to be for me to be able to test a predictive relationship, one of 3 conditions has to exist. I either have to have longitudinal data, so data over time, which I do not have because the surveys are cross-sectional. They are taken only at one period of time. I have to have a fully randomized design, which I do not have, right? I don't have fully randomized data. Or I have to have pre-existing theory suggesting that relationship might exist. Therefore, whenever I test predictive relationships, I have to have some type of theory suggesting that relationship exists. Otherwise, I only look at correlations and only state correlations are there.
So when you had the work, the burnout, you mentioned those kind of different factors that the questions are about. I see 6 of them here. Listen, right? Work overload, lack of control, insufficient rewards, breakdown of community, absence of fairness, and value conflicts. You said that's part of a larger inventory or a larger burnout assessment that.
So I didn't. In order to do this, so let me back up. When you create new construct items, you tend to go back to previous definitions and theory. And so instead of picking items out of a previous 20, because that would have been tricky to pull those out, what I did instead is I went back to the definition of burnout and the previous theories of burnout. And burnout's definition covers those 6 items. Okay. So we wrote items based on the definition of burnout.
I think that's really interesting in and of itself, right? I mean, no matter what the data and the report says, I mean, it's page, I guess, 31. There's some links about that, just for people to think about that, right? About, what are the factors? Because it's not just, I don't sleep enough, or I'm always on call, or right. I mean, there's kind of things like that, but it's just the general environment. If you're thinking about your environment, it kind of sums it up, right? Are people overloaded, right? Is it unreasonable demand on them? Do they feel out of control? Do they not have the right rewards? Do they, are they isolated, or there's unsupportive, breakdown of community, right? Are they not supported? Absence of fairness, right? Do things feel like it's unfair, or it's always piled on you? And value conflicts, right? When what you're judged on, your organization's judged on being different. I'm just kind of doing my own armchair summary here. Mm-hmm. I think those are really interesting elemental things for people to think about. So whether or not it's even before they even get to the report data, just thinking about thinking more about those individually, and questioning: are you in an environment, or are you creating an environment that that does it support or counteract these problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, so we tend to be really careful about creating constructs, right? So the key is making sure you start from a very, very clear definition, right?
Yeah,
you really want to make sure that you know exactly what it is that you're capturing and measuring.
Sure.
Well, so Josh Corman, we've had him on the show, and so they did an MBI in the SEC community, secure, IT SEC community, and so we've been wanting to do the MBI, and I'm still hoping to do this, and I want to pull you in, Nicole, for this.
Oh, that'd be great.
Josh and I have been talking about really just doing the pure MBI, and you get a document. There's like 3 vendors that will help you do this. One of them is Mausch herself, who supports one of the vendors, and so they'll send you. And I've got all the documentation. So the people that did the ITsec burnouts sent me all the everything, and one of them is like this 30-page thing. And being not a data scientist, and offline, I definitely want to ask you questions about psychometrics, because actually that's one of the highest paid jobs right now. But that's another whole subject.
It's fascinating, and I will say, like, shit surveys are shit. But writing good survey questions is amazing. And for people who are interested in burnout, by the way, Christine Maslek did give the session at Velocity Santa Clara.
Yeah, I know, and I missed it. I was on my one vacation I had forever.
I think it's videoed. I think there's video.
Okay, I need to go watch it. But that document is, just to summarize my meat and potatoes way, it's almost like spending an incredible amount of time figuring out how to game, and I'm not talking like a scientist now, but game the question so that people don't think they're actually, because you can't ask somebody, are you burnt out, right? Like, is burnout affecting you, right? Like, that whole document that they send is very clearly about figuring out a way to ask these questions in a way where you're not leading the witness, if you will, again, not data scientists. So
exactly.
So I think
it
sounds like
so. That's why writing good survey questions and then figuring out how to analyze them to make sure you've done it well is such. It's part science and part art, right? It's a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really cool. So anyway, we do want to do one, and I think if we can draft off of what Puppet has done and get the same kind of numbers in our community. I mean, one of the things that Josh had said is. It's funny, I'm looking at what's the data right now from the ITsec, right? And the 3 things that they scored on is exhaustion, cynicism, and personal efficacy, right? Like those are, that's the way they kind of bound the how likely are you a cynic, or do you feel like you actually are making impact? So that you can clearly see how the efficacy could be one of the important things without kind of asking the direct questions, right? Anyway, it was very interesting. So
Nicole, so everybody knows about your the survey now, and your work around that. What about your day job? I mean, what are you up to now? What other what other things are you working on? And what do you have to share around that?
So I'm a chef, and my official title is Director of Organizational Performance and Analytics, and it's super cool, actually. So part of it is I get to do that. I get to do research in the space because they believe that it's important for me to continue helping advancing the field and helping DevOps understand how we make an impact on teams and organizations, and what goes into DevOps and what are the important things, which for me was ideal, because I do think that's important. But another piece of it is, really helping Chef understand how to optimize its own performance. And, we joke, measure all the things or rub science on things. So sometimes that's...
Did you say rub science on things?
Yes.
That's good.
Or Matt Damon, I'm sorry, I'm going to give this away from The Martian, is I'm going to have to science the shit out of this thing. So stuff on Mars.
Yes.
Pretty cool.
Yes. And so occasionally I get pulled in, for side projects, and it's, either sometimes just on, the employee health survey. What's a good way to measure this? And so we, help write up internal questions for the internal survey using good psychometric methods, or we use the Westrum culture questions that have been used in the State of DevOps survey and that have now been written up in the metrics white paper that was released for the DevOps Enterprise Forum Guidance white paper that was just released last week at DevOps Enterprise Summit 2015. So, I get pulled into external side conversations just to help the shit out of things.
So for anybody who didn't listen, the whole Ron Westrum thing, I learned about that indirectly from Jez, but I guess from Gene in the survey. But I went back and read it. Some really good paper about organizations are pathological, bureaucratic, or generative. Right? It's in the survey, but the paper is actually pretty interesting. So I wanted to point that out. But I want you to tell our audience, because when Cameron Haight from Gartner, who is a big fan, we are big fans of him at Gartner. He's been a great steward of Gartner covering DevOps. Cameron, if you're listening, we love you. He wrote a brilliant article. He's awesome. He is totally awesome. We love him. He wrote this great article about you going to Ops Code Chef and about how you were going to do data science there, and I think when I heard that, I'm like, God, every startup should have their own Nicole. And so I want you to tell the world, if you're a startup, there's two things I want you to tell, and I know you won't disagree. If you do, I'll be floored. Collect everything. Collect every possible
measure all the
data.
Things.
Exactly. And the second is every startup should have a data scientist.
Yes. Preferably, if possible, with a background or at least an understanding of what it is that you do.
It sounds like psychometrics is the key word here.
Well, so sometimes psychometrics, right? Because psychometrics can be good psychometrics is, the art of asking survey questions. But Chef was incredibly insightful because they understood that I had a background in IT operations.
Yeah.
And so they grabbed me, and that's really what I think Cameron Haight also noticed. It was fascinating. So I actually met Cameron last year at Velocity 2014, and Gene Kim was lovely. He was going around the room, and I think that was when I met you, Damon, also. Was at a pre-Velocity event. He was introducing me, saying that I had kind of introduced science to the Puppet Labs 2014 State of DevOps report. And Cameron said, "Oh yeah, I know Nicole." And Gene's like thinking he was being polite, saying, "Oh no, Nicole's done this. She's been in this space." And Cameron said, "No, I've been following her work since 07, 08. She came out of University of Arizona." And I'm like, "Wait, what? Pardon? Are you kidding me?" And he had been following my work since, like I said, 07, 08. He knew about my conference papers. I mean, he had been following my work and my research on sysadmins and how they do their work, and how they choose the tools and how they do knowledge sharing. And I was floored. I mean, as an academic, I had been going to industry conferences. I'd been going to LISA. I'd been trying to get people in industry to pay attention to what we were doing in academia for years. Cameron knew exactly who I was. And so
he's the real deal. Yeah.
He totally is. He is the real deal. And so when he found out I was coming to Chef, he called me up on the phone and he said, is there any way I can get a quick phone call with you, because more companies need to be doing this. The fact that Chef was so insightful to find you and bring you in-house because you understand their industry, you can do data science, you can help them optimize their own processes internal in-house because this is what you've been doing for years. And then the fact that Cameron immediately understood what Chef had done was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think we helped educate. Me and Damon and Gene were a big part of educating Cameron, and he'll tell you that. But I've got to do
awesome.
my own little bragging here. Is I love Gene, and getting introduced to people like Josh and through Gene is awesome. But I got introduced to you through Mark Burgess, so I think I'm pretty proud of that. At least
that's right.
Yeah, so that's pretty awesome right there, right? I had Mark Burgess is the one who said I want you to meet Nicole, and like what, and you are, again, I did just get a little starstruck. I mean, you are the real deal because you have sysadmin chops along with the best of them, and you're a data scientist, and like what better combo to be, in this day and age in this business, I've said this all along. This is why I'm such a big fan of yours. So.
Yeah. Well, hey, we're all big fans, and thanks for a great survey. I know these are the funniest things. It's it's not anyone's day job, but we appreciate the effort that's gone into it, and I think I'd love to see where this is going, right? And I think it's really starting to get some interesting questions, and I hope it gets the due that it deserves. So if people want to, I guess the survey is pretty easy to find. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. But where else can people find your work or get in touch with you if they want to?
So on Twitter, I'm at NicoleFV. That's NICOLE, F as in Frank, V as in Victor. I also have a website, NicoleForsgren.com. And
cool.
You guys can always hit me up there.
All right. We'll put those in the show notes as well. Thanks for joining us. We'll have to get you back on and talk about the next interesting set of data you get. And, John, buddy, as always, good talking to you.
Yeah, great stuff.
And everybody listening at home, thanks a lot, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks so much.